Good afternoon, everyone. It is July 27th, and I'm going to talk about some of the offensive operations the Russians are taking, as well as the counteroffensive operations the Ukrainians are taking. Some of this stuff took place yesterday, but I didn't want to talk about it because a lot of the battlefield is fluid, and some of the gains being made by either Russia or Ukraine can be somewhat impermanent. They may just be temporary gains. So, with some of these gains by both Russia and Ukraine taking place, I can talk about them a little more in depth because they seem to be more permanent movements moving forward. Now, I'm talking about two specific places. The first is going to be in this region right here. That's where the Russians have made some gains. And then down in here is where the Ukrainians have made some gains. Obviously, Bakhmut, there's been some gains made. I talked about those in my last video. Since then, not a whole lot has taken place. That's right here. So I'm just not going to focus on that today. Just mainly looking at Zaparesia and then up near Lyman, Torsk, and Izium. So let's go ahead and zoom in on where I'm talking about specifically here. This is Zaparesia. And before I talk about the offensive operations, let's just set the standards for what we're looking at with regard to Russia. So you have the first line of defense that sits right here. You have a second line of defense that sits right here. You have what is essentially like a 2.5 line of defense. It could be their third line, but generally when you see defenses this close, it is a fallback position for the occupiers of another level of defense. But they could have forces in those. We've seen from an intelligence perspective as we provide overwatch to this is these later stage lines of defense aren't manned, or they're just very sporadically manned in order for the Russians to fall back. So this is what you'll see in the line of defense, and it kind of arches around right here. But again, it's very sporadic. So what we are seeing is the Ukrainians launching a significant mechanized counteroffensive operation over the last 24 or so hours, and they've broken through the first line of defense of Russia through here. There have been geolocated footage of Ukrainian equipment 3 kilometers east of Roboton, which is right here. So somewhere in this area right here, we have Ukrainian equipment that is geolocated moving. That means that they have passed the first line of defense of the Russians. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to hold the ground, but make no mistake, this is progress. The Russians are using an elastic defense system here where they're bending their defenses a bit to try to drive them back. But this is a very deep penetration for an elastic defense to hold for a long term. If they aren't reinforced, if Russia or if Ukraine continues to flood troops into this gap between Roboton and Verbova, they may see some successes. There have been very sporadic reports here. Between some are saying there's been 40 vehicles, some are saying 80 vehicles, some are saying 2 to 4 battalions of troops, which can be anywhere between 800 and 4,000 troops, but not 100% sure on what the Ukrainians used here. The geolocated point for all this equipment, though, is the forwardmost point that Ukraine has made it to in this counteroffensive. So there's a very significant development in this sector. Part of this comes from Ukrainians appearing to have rotated fresh forces into this area. And by fresh, I don't mean new faces. I mean probably recuperated forces that are more battle-hardened, more prepared to fight and ready to fight, but they got some downtime so that they could recuperate. And the Ukrainians actually use a good rotation system to keep their troops fresh, to keep them their morale high, whereas Russians, and especially in the Russian military blogger space, talk about the problems Russia has with rotating forces. In fact, many on the front lines aren't rotating out at all in the last few months of this counteroffensive battle, and to have a constant shelling, a constant front line of troops causes a massive wear and tear both on their physical health but also their mental health, and makes them less effective at defending the lines that Ukraine is trying to punch through. Now, what punching through here allows Ukraine to do is to flank the whole of the rear echelon of the Russian defensive lines. Unless Russia decides to push defenses forward, reinforcements forward, which would be reservists, this whole line is at risk of falling, which could open up a massive gap for the Ukrainians to try and flood through, and take what is their ultimate objective, and that is Tokmak down here. So before moving up to where Russia is seeing more successes, I want to talk about what this counteroffensive is looking like for Ukraine. There's generally 6 or 7 phases to a counteroffensive operation, and they often bounce back and forth between one another. It's not like phase 1 is done, move to phase 2. No, you could have phase 1 happen, then phase 2, and then 3, and then back to 2, and then 3 and 2 complement each other. So phase 1 is you try to shape the battlefield. You try to draw out, kill reserve troops. You try to pull Russian troops to the front line so you can hit them with your cluster munitions, your HIMARS, etc. During this time, there's recons, there's counter recons, there's just adjusting to the battlefield. These are done by what is number 3, which is probing attacks, shaping operations, trying to determine where the enemy is, hitting them in their weakest points to attrit troops. This is used by number 3, which is artillery, through counter battery artillery from Ukraine at the Russians and vice versa. Then you conduct your full-scale attack once this situation is set. And are we seeing that right now? I don't know. You conduct the attack to try to have a breakthrough. Yes, it looks like we're starting to have a breakthrough right here, but it's still early in the fight. And then once you break through, you can exploit the being behind enemy lines, so to speak. So the reason I'm kind of hesitant to say this is the full brunt of the attack is a couple of reasons. One, I don't see the equipment that normally we would see in a large multi-brigade combined arms fight. There's no Strikers, no CV-90s. We don't see a lot of the more westernized giant tanks other than the Leopards. I mean, we have no Challengers. We're only looking at battalion level movements of maybe 2,000 to 3,000 troops, a couple of battalions. This isn't brigade combined arms, and the Ukrainians have as many as 9 uncommitted brigades right now readied for this counteroffensive, and that's significant. We're talking potentially as many as 30 to 40,000 troops, and we're not seeing that kind level of push just yet. So I'm not 100% sure this is the main effort. It might just be the very first stages of the main effort, and they're exploiting a weakness they have found in the Russian front lines. So let's go ahead and zoom in on where Russia has seen some successes in the last 24 hours or so. Up here, heading towards the Kharkiv region. So there's 2 areas, and focusing specifically on this region right here. But there's 2 areas where Russia has seen some movements that are positive for Russia. One of them I'm a bit skeptical of as to how the movements are taking place. The first is this Torsk movement, where they have kind of extended themselves forward, but the Ukrainians are now attacking flanks, and it potentially sets up a double envelopment in which troops can be cut off, and then any Russian troops left in this area may be dealing with a bad situation. The Russians actually recognized this was taking place and ceased the forward push and stabilized the front line, but this also allowed the Russians to open up a second axis of movement where they're moving into Ukrainian territory and actually having some successes in doing it. And that is up here in this region as they push towards the Novohorivka, the town here, and really try to take what is essentially the high ground. The high ground in this is right in here, and it is significantly higher. We're talking about having to run up like 60 to 100 foot hills to get to the top here, which matters significantly. The Ukrainians have artillery overwatch on all of this region here, but the Russians have been able to break through and cross the river and establish a bridgehead. Now, when I say establish a bridgehead, it doesn't necessarily mean they're establishing a bridgehead where they're funneling massive amounts of equipment. In fact, the bridging capability of the Russians in this area is not good. So what we're looking at is light infantry taking this. And as we've seen before, light infantry that overextends its armored capability is prime targets for cluster munitions, which Ukraine has been using quite effectively. So Russia has seen successes here. They have taken some ground here, but that has largely stopped due to Ukraine owning the high ground and Russia not being able to get the equipment here. What Russia's intent here was more likely to not necessarily be to take huge swaths of ground and threaten Kharkiv, but to give the Ukrainians a bit of a nervous pause in how they're conducting operations elsewhere. So we were just looking here. If Russia continues to take ground and push towards towns, Ukraine is eventually going to have to focus on that somewhat, meaning they'll pull troops from potentially Bakhmut or pull it from Donetsk or the Zaparesia front to try and reinforce this region. As we've seen recently, the first three pushes that Russia had taking place in this region were largely stopped. The third one stopped because Russia overextended itself, with the fourth being the only one that is somewhat successful, but we haven't heard any further movements from there. So a bit of back and forth right now between Ukraine and Russia on territory being taken. We'll have to see exactly what happens in the next 24 to 48 hours as well.